A massive figure floating on suspensors, a cruel smirk hiding a razor-sharp mind. Baron Vladimir Harkonnen is one of Dune's most infamous villains, a genius of manipulation or a decadent tyrant consumed by his own excesses. His enemies feared him, his allies obeyed him, and his house thrived under his ruthless rule. But was he truly a mastermind, or was his downfall inevitable from the start? Today we dive into the mind of the Baron, unraveling his brilliance, his brutality, and the fatal arrogance that sealed his fate. Baron Vladimir Harkonnen understood one fundamental truth. Power is not about loyalty. It is about control. Unlike the noble House Atreides, which thrived on honor and the loyalty of its people, House Harkonnen built its empire on fear, brutality, and deception. And no one embodied this philosophy more than the Baron himself. From his seat on Giedi Prime, a planet shaped by his merciless rule, the Baron established a reign of terror that extended far beyond his homeworld. He crushed dissent with an iron fist, ensuring that no one, not his subjects, not his rivals, not even his own family, could challenge his dominance. His methods were not merely violent, they were calculated. Fear, he believed, was the most effective tool for maintaining order. If people obeyed out of love, they could betray you. If they obeyed out of terror, they never dared. The Baron's web of manipulation stretched far beyond his planetary borders. He infiltrated the imperial court with spies, corrupted key officials, and used blackmail, bribery, and murder to secure his influence. His greatest display of political cunning was his orchestration of House Atreides' downfall. By exploiting his ties with Emperor Shaddam IV, he secured the use of the Sardaukar, the Empire's elite death troops, to wipe out his long-standing rivals. But even in victory, the Baron's strategy was laced with cruelty. He did not simply seek to defeat Duke Leto Atreides. He sought to humiliate and destroy him utterly, ensuring that the very name of House Atreides would be erased from history. Yet, for all his brilliance, the Baron had one fatal flaw: his love for excess. Where Duke Leto inspired admiration, the Baron inspired revulsion. His massive, grotesque form, sustained by suspensors due to his own indulgences, was a reflection of his unrestrained appetites, both physical and political. His ability to manipulate, to control, and to instill fear made him powerful, but his arrogance, his belief in his own invincibility, would set the stage for his ultimate fall. Because in the shadows, one survivor of House Atreides was about to rise, and the Baron, in all his cruelty, had failed to see the storm coming. For all his grotesque excesses, there was no denying one thing: Baron Vladimir Harkonnen was a master strategist. Unlike many rulers who relied on brute force alone, he understood the power of patience, deception, and long-term planning. His schemes were not reckless, they were methodical, designed with precision to ensure not just victory, but total domination. His most infamous move was the destruction of House Atreides. This was not a simple military conquest. It was a carefully orchestrated trap, designed to make Duke Leto believe he had won a prize when, in reality, he was walking straight into a death sentence. By convincing Emperor Shaddam IV to offer Arrakis to House Atreides, the Baron made it seem like a grand political opportunity, but in the shadows, he had already planted the seeds of their destruction. First, he embedded a traitor within the Atreides ranks, Dr. Yue, a man whose loyalty was supposed to be unbreakable. But the Baron understood weakness better than anyone. He exploited Yue's love for his captive wife, manipulating him into betraying the Duke at the perfect moment. Second, he used his wealth and influence to secure the ultimate weapon, the Sardaukar, the Emperor's fanatical shock troops. With their help, his forces crushed the Atreides in one swift, brutal night, proving that even the noblest house in the Landsraad could fall under his grasp. And yet, even at the height of his triumph, cracks in the Baron's plan began to show. His decision to install his brutish nephew, Glossu Rabban, known as the Beast, as ruler of Arrakis was a tactical misstep. Rabban was strong, but he lacked subtlety. He ruled with an iron fist, but without strategy. Instead of controlling Arrakis, he turned the people against House Harkonnen, fueling Fremen resistance rather than suppressing it. The Baron believed he could easily replace Rabban with his more cunning nephew, Feyd-Rautha, when the time was right. But by then, it was too late. Because the Baron had overlooked one key variable: Paul Atreides. Believing Paul to be dead, he dismissed the possibility of a true rebellion. He underestimated the Fremen, seeing them as little more than desert savages. He focused on securing Arrakis for its spice, failing to understand that he was not truly in control of the planet. The desert belonged to the Fremen, and the Fremen had found their leader. Despite his many victories, the Baron's strategic brilliance was ultimately undermined by one fatal flaw: his inability to recognize threats outside his narrow view of power. He had spent years perfecting his methods of political manipulation, his networks of informants, and his iron grip on those beneath him. But in doing so, he became blind to forces that operated beyond the walls of the imperial court and the Landsraad. One of his greatest mistakes was underestimating the desert itself. He viewed Arrakis as nothing more than a resource to be exploited, failing to grasp the deeper connection between the Fremen and their environment. To the Baron, power came from wealth, control, and military might. He believed that the spice trade could be controlled through brute force, but he did not understand that the true rulers of Arrakis were not those who sat on its throne, but those who thrived in its sands. His dismissal of the Fremen as an insignificant, scattered people was a grave miscalculation. By installing Raban, he only fueled their resentment and strengthened their will to fight. He assumed that fear alone would keep them in line, not realizing that he was cultivating the very rebellion that would destroy him. Had he taken the time to truly understand the planet he had fought so hard to control, he might have seen the danger before it was too late. Even within his own house, the Baron's arrogance led him to misjudge those closest to him. He saw his nephew Feyd-Rautha as his perfect heir, ruthless, ambitious, and cunning, yet he failed to recognize that Feyd did not share his loyalty. The Baron believed he was molding his successor into an extension of himself, a younger and sharper mind that would carry on the Harkonnen legacy. But in truth, Feyd harbored his own ambitions and saw his uncle not as a mentor but as an obstacle. The Baron's failure to fully control even his own chosen heir was yet another sign of his growing blindness to the forces around him. And then, there was Paul. The Baron had planned everything, anticipated every move, controlled every piece on the board, but he had made one fatal assumption. He believed that once Duke Leto was dead, the game was over. He did not account for the resilience of House Atreides, nor did he consider the prophecy-fueled power that Paul would come to wield. By the time he realized his mistake, it was already too late. Paul had not only survived, but he had become something far more dangerous than just a political rival. He had become a messianic figure, a leader with an army of Fremen warriors bound to him by faith. The Baron had spent his life controlling people through fear, but Paul had discovered something far more powerful: devotion. As the Fremen forces rose against him, the Baron saw his empire begin to crumble. He had played his game with brilliance, manipulating the highest levels of the Imperium, crushing his enemies with ruthless efficiency, but in the end he had built his power on a foundation of arrogance. And that arrogance was about to cost him everything. For all his cunning and strategic brilliance, Baron Vladimir Harkonnen was doomed by his own excesses. He was not merely a man of ambition, he was a man of indulgence, a ruler who reveled in cruelty, gluttony, and absolute domination. His body, swollen to unnatural proportions and sustained only by suspensors, was a physical manifestation of his own unchecked appetites. But it was not just his grotesque form that symbolized his corruption. It was his mindset, his arrogance, and his insatiable hunger for control that ultimately led to his demise. The Baron's rule was one of absolute tyranny. He did not inspire loyalty, he demanded submission. His political empire was held together by fear and brute force, but fear alone is not a lasting foundation. Unlike House Atreides, which cultivated devotion and trust, the Baron ruled through intimidation, always believing that his power was unquestionable. This made him blind to the weaknesses in his own structure. His perverse desire for dominance extended beyond politics. The Baron indulged in sadistic pleasures, taking delight in the suffering of others, not just as a means of control, but as a personal amusement. His cruelty was not merely a tool, it was a pastime. He treated his enemies with mockery and contempt, believing himself untouchable. But this very excess, his complete disregard for the humanity of others, would come back to haunt him. Nowhere was his decadence more apparent than in his handling of Arrakis. While his obsession with power was calculated, his gluttonous approach to control was reckless. Instead of securing Arrakis with care, he plundered its wealth, overexploited the spice trade, and crushed any opposition with brute force. He could have ruled with subtlety, weaving the Fremen into his control, or managing the spice flow with caution. But subtlety was not in the Baron's nature. Greed was, and in his endless consumption, he failed to see the seeds of rebellion growing right under his nose. His personal life was just as plagued by excess. He surrounded himself with sycophants and enforcers, trusting only those he could intimidate or manipulate. His arrogance led him to believe that everyone had a price, that no one could truly oppose him. This arrogance extended even to his own family. He played Rabban and Feyd-Rautha against each other, believing that he alone would always be the master. But he underestimated Feyd's ambition, just as he had underestimated Paul's resilience. In the end, the Baron's greatest failure was his inability to recognize that power, when abused, breeds its own destruction. He believed himself untouchable, yet he was surrounded by those who wanted him dead. He had built an empire of fear, yet he never realized that fear is a fragile weapon. It keeps people in line only until they find something stronger to believe in. And that something was Paul Atreides. As the Fremen rose in rebellion, as Paul claimed his rightful place as Muad'Dib, the Baron's world crumbled around him. His greed, his arrogance, and his excesses had finally caught up with him. He had spent his life ensuring absolute dominance, and yet, in the end, he was reduced to a powerless pawn, trapped, desperate, and utterly at the mercy of his greatest enemy. And then, in one final moment of poetic justice, the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, once the most feared man in the Imperium, was slain not by a warrior's blade, not by an assassin's poison, but by a child. Alia Atreides, the daughter of the Duke he had destroyed, delivered his execution in the most fitting way possible. A death as grotesque and humiliating as the life he had led. The Baron had always believed he was playing the game of power better than anyone else. But in the end, he was just another ruler blinded by his own indulgence, too arrogant to see the inevitable storm approaching. And when the storm came, it washed him away without mercy. Even after his grotesque demise, Baron Vladimir Harkonnen's influence did not vanish overnight. His death was not the end of House Harkonnen, at least not yet. He had spent years cultivating his successors, molding them into instruments of his will. But just like everything the Baron touched, his legacy was built on corruption, deceit, and hunger for power. The two figures who stood in line to inherit his empire were his nephews, Glossu Rabban and Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen. These two men embodied different aspects of the Baron's rule, yet neither could truly replace him. Glossu Rabban, nicknamed the Beast, was a brute, a man who embodied the worst excesses of Harkonnen cruelty without the cunning to make it sustainable. The Baron had used him as a temporary ruler of Arrakis, knowing full well that Rabban's brutality would make the population suffer to the breaking point. The plan was simple. Let Rabban squeeze Arrakis dry with his incompetence and violence, and when the time was right, remove him and replace him with Feyd-Rautha, who would be welcomed as a savior by comparison. But the Baron underestimated just how much damage Rabban would cause. His savage rule did not just create resentment, it fueled a full-scale rebellion. By the time Paul Atreides returned as Muad'Dib, the Baron's careful scheming was unraveling at an uncontrollable pace. Rabban was not just a temporary villain in the Baron's game, he became a liability that helped seal the fate of the Harkonnens. See, if Rabban was a hammer, Feyd-Rautha was a dagger, sharp, precise, and deadly. He was everything the Baron wished he could be in his youth, charismatic, intelligent, and ruthless without restraint. Feyd was trained to be the next ruler of House Harkonnen, a leader who could maintain the family's brutal dominance while being clever enough to avoid the pitfalls of Rabban's reckless tyranny. The Baron's favoritism toward Feyd was clear. He nurtured the young man's ambition, guiding him toward power while also ensuring he remained under control. But the Baron made a crucial miscalculation. Feyd was not as loyal as he seemed. Like his uncle, Feyd-Rautha was consumed by ambition. But unlike the Baron, he was not patient. He was willing to challenge authority, to take risks, and to carve out his own path. In a way, he was a mirror of Paul Atreides, a young noble with the potential to reshape the Imperium. The difference? Paul fought for survival and legacy, while Feyd fought for personal dominance. Yet despite all his potential, Feyd met his end before he could truly rise to power. In a dramatic duel against Paul Atreides, the heir of House Harkonnen was slain, marking the final nail in the coffin for his house. With his death, the last serious challenge to Paul's rule vanished, and House Harkonnen, once the embodiment of political and military power, was shattered. With both Rabban and Feyd-Rautha gone, the power vacuum left by the Baron was impossible to fill. House Harkonnen had thrived under his ruthless leadership, but it could not survive without him. His ability to manipulate, to control, and to rule through fear had kept his family dominant for decades. But in his arrogance, he had built a dynasty that relied solely on his personal power. Without him, it all collapsed. Paul Atreides, now emperor, did more than just defeat House Harkonnen. He erased them. Their holdings were seized, their political influence was stripped away, and their name was left as nothing more than a shadow in history. The very legacy the Baron had worked so hard to build was wiped out in a single generation. Yet, in a way, House Harkonnen did not truly disappear. Its influence lived on, not just in the horrors it had inflicted, but in the lessons it had left behind. The Baron's tactics, his manipulations, and his ruthlessness became a cautionary tale, a lesson on the dangers of excess, the fragility of power built on fear, and the inevitable downfall of those who believe themselves untouchable. And so, the question remains, was Baron Vladimir Harkonnen a brilliant strategist who played the game of power better than anyone else? Or was he simply another tyrant whose hunger for control blinded him to his own destruction? One thing is certain, his name will never be forgotten. Baron Vladimir Harkonnen was a man of contradictions. He was both a political mastermind and a grotesque tyrant, a figure of immense power, yet ultimately doomed by his own arrogance. His empire, built on fear and manipulation, should have made him untouchable, yet in the end, he was outmaneuvered, undone by the very forces he sought to control. His brilliance as a strategist is undeniable. Few men could orchestrate the downfall of House Atreides, manipulate the Emperor, and maintain a reign of terror for decades. His understanding of power, how to acquire it, how to wield it, and how to crush his enemies, made him one of the most formidable figures in the Dune universe. But power built on fear is inherently fragile. The Baron never inspired loyalty, only obedience. And obedience lasts only as long as there is no stronger force to challenge it. That force came in the form of Paul Atreides. The Baron's greatest mistake was failing to see that true power does not come from control alone. It comes from belief, from unity, from something greater than just force. While the Baron ruled through terror, Paul commanded through faith. And when the moment of reckoning came, it was not the Baron's wealth, his armies, or his political schemes that saved him. It was his enemies, armed not just with weapons, but with conviction, who brought his downfall. His death was poetic, killed not by a rival duke or an imperial assassin, but by Alia Atreides, a child, yet one who embodied the very legacy he tried to destroy. His grotesque figure, once so feared, reduced to a pitiful, flailing end, a fitting demise for a man who believed himself invincible. But was he simply a monster, or was he something more? A tragic figure, a product of a brutal world where only the most ruthless survived. In another time, with different choices, could the Baron have been more than just a villain? That is a question left to history, and to us. What do you think? Was Baron Vladimir Harkonnen a brilliant architect of power, or merely a decadent tyrant, doomed by his own excess? Let me know in the comments. And as always, the spice must flow.